Hello, hello, and welcome to This Week in the Middle East with myself, Francis Matthew, and Eddie O'Sullivan, my co-host. And this week, we're joined by Hamish McRae, one of the leading thinkers on forward-looking planning, global future trends, economy, and the author of a very interesting book called The World in 2050. Oh, and Eddie, you've got a copy. There it is. There it is. So no self-promotion from Hamish this time. Well done. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you. Enough. Hamish, you're looking ahead here a very long way. But surely, I mean, how do you keep it focused? How do you make it happen? What's the sort of methodology in all this?
Well, I wrote a book about the world in 2020, 25 years ago, when I was rather younger, and we suddenly reached it and had a look at it, and there was enough in there to encourage me to have another whack at it. I was able to get enough of it right. Got some things wrong, of course. So I had another look, and since then there've been two things have happened which I make it rather easier. There've been one or two things that make it much harder. We'll come to those in a moment. But one thing that makes it easier is the work of Angus Maddison, who was an economic historian who looked back through history. And did you know at the time of Christ, the world's largest economy was actually India, second largest was China, and Western Europe was a poor third. And of course, in between the two, the Middle East was the connecting place in the world between these three big forces of the economy. And the other thing, of course, is Goldman Sachs' BRICS report, Brazil, Russia, India, China, which has really transformed the way the emerging world thinks about itself.
Can I just ask, Hamish, because I mean, economic forecasters have got models that they use. So they have a model how an economy works, how growth happens, and they put the data in and they have a forecast. And weather forecasters have a similar approach. But your approach isn't like that, is it? It's there's a lot of intuition involved in it, I suspect.
Well, I think that you have to connect the two. You have to connect your intuition to the formal forecasts. You don't reject them. And I found actually the BRICS report, that done back in 2002, I think it was, probably the most influential piece of economic analysis this century. Yeah. Because you have the BRICS, the BRICS annual summit, you have the BRICS Bank, you have all that. You have China using that forum as a way of projecting its power around the world. You have Belt and Road arising out of all that. So there is that bit of economic research, which I think is not a bad basis. The only thing I'd say to that is that BRICS was right as to concept, but wrong as to detail. There have been other people who've done it better. And the people I really rank is our HSBC, who have done some forward projecting using these growth models. And you have to say, well, this isn't right, but this is a good anchor to start with. One more thought: it showed that China, when they first did it, that China would pass the US in size sometime in the 2020s, maybe around 2030. Well, I think that's rolled back now, but it's a good framework to think about. And I think you then apply your intuition on top of that and say, okay, this is where we start, but actually this is wrong because of A, B, and C.
And so one of the big features of the next, we're going ahead now 20, 30 years, is the rise of Asia, that China will become a much more dominant player. So I'd like to tease out your thoughts. I mean, there's from two angles. One is that China is not happy to play along with the rules that were created in 1945-48, when the victors of the Second World War invented our current system. But also, the Middle East has got a very lively, the Gulf certainly, a lively awareness of, in this new world, which is going to shift, the rules are going to change, the Gulf wants to play both sides and be a friend with America and the West, but equally a friend with China. Indeed. How do you see that one work?
Indeed. Well, and Abu Dhabi, the UAE, has now joined the BRICS group, I think earlier this year sometime.
Yes, it did.
So absolutely. Well, I think that if you step back, we have at the moment two rival groupings, as you say. The China wants to set up a parallel grouping, is in fair measure succeeding in doing that. The question is, and nobody wants to have to choose, or nobody in the emerging world wants to have to choose between the two. You want to be nice to both, indeed almost, dare I say it, play the two off against each other, as people used to play the US against the Soviet Union. How I see this panning out, and this is one of those big intuitive judgments that may be wrong. I think China will not want to go on racing on to dominate the world. It'll have some kind of discontinuity. As it becomes older, its older people will want the state to look after themselves rather than, go and take over the economies of other countries. Your point, the way Xi has gone now, I think, is a big setback for the economy of China. In trying to protect its political power, the economy is actually being pushed back. And then, of course, the US is going to be much more aggressive, more so even than now, in trying to contain China. So I think that for the Middle East, it's a very good position to be in. Huge resources. You want to talk to both and have a good relationship with both. But ultimately, in 10 or 15 years' time, I think it'll be pretty clear which side you prefer out of those two.
But it's in Abu Dhabi, when the 75-year oil concessions came up. Abu Dhabi is one of the few places where oil was never nationalized. So the foreign companies own their share. And the old partners of Iraq Petroleum Company, the largely Western firms, found their share diminished as Abu Dhabi brought in Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Indian oil firms, amongst many others, in order to look more strategically to the east.
I didn't know the detail on that, but it seemed to me that that's extremely sensible. It's absolutely what you should be doing. Even if China doesn't pass the US to become the world's largest economy, and I think that's on the cusp. We don't know yet. I think saw one statistic suggesting it never would. One piece of work. But look, you absolutely have to have a good relationship with the whole of the rest of the world economy.
Eddie?
Well, once we're looking at this, I was looking at your chart in your book, which shows one of the contradictions, perhaps, in your forecast is it a good thing to have lots of young people, or is it a bad thing? Because we were talking earlier, Francis was talking about the challenge that the Middle East faces. And the Middle East has got one of the highest population growth rates in the world. And they still have very large families right across the region. Now, it's partly ideological, you might argue. And Francis was saying, well, that's the big problem, because you're going to have to create jobs. And yet, at the same time, in your book, you do actually look, you've got a projection, and you've got this aging population in Europe and in Japan, and you say in China, and you suggest that's a bad thing. So, isn't there? How do you reconcile this aging issue?
Well, the older I get, the less sure I am that it's such a bad thing. I think what we have to do is persuade older people to go on working, frankly, and not expect to draw a gold-plated pension at the age of 65. And actually, all the numbers look much, much better if people work for another 5 years or so. You don't.
That's from a European perspective.
Exactly. As a preamble to the point about if you are young, you have the huge challenge of educating your young people. And then the second challenge, when you have educated them, retaining them in your own country. So I think that by and large, you will get more growth if you have a youthful population. But that growth will only really increase general standards of living if those people are educated and are able to carry out the economic functions, exporting the goods and services that they need. What you don't want is to export all your best people to Western Europe or North America and have them carry on the show there, helping these aging nations cope with the demographic headwind.
Well, one of the issues is the obviously the United States general election which is taking place, and immigration is a really key issue there.
Yeah.
Control of population, and also in Europe with Marine Le Pen, and then France. It was mentioned in the Middle East. There is this concern they've got too many. Their population, they've got too many people, and they can't create the jobs. So the one of the things that John Mearsheimer, who's also a forecaster of the future and a realist, and he said, well, one of the positive things for America is that they have such a large number of migrants coming into the country. And they say that's one of the reasons why America, in due course, will probably continue to be the global power that you forecast, is because they have had so many immigrants. So, I mean, I don't know, is there any way of reconciling the contradictions between, on the one hand, people are concerned about uncontrolled migration, or migration full stop, which is a European and American concern, and people who say, well, actually, on the other hand, it's a good thing because Western advanced economies are not reproducing the rate they were, and they need lots of migrants. How do you reconcile that for a long-term forecast, Hamish? Or is that just one of those unresolved issues?
It's one of the great, huge issues about which we don't know. I think that we can. I think one has to break it down to bite-sized chunks. I think uncontrolled immigration is never going to be popular, and actually very difficult socially. You're restricting people who follow the rules coming in, and then you allow people in who don't follow the rules. And socially, you can't do that. Societies can't work on that basis. So I think that is one point. I think a second point, your point, if you look at many of the great businesses in America, they have been created by immigrants or the sons of immigrants. From Steve Jobs onwards. Now, a lot of the artificial intelligence companies are created by immigrants, or as they say sometimes, the sons, mostly sons, not daughters of immigrants. So I think economic vibrancy is generated by having immigrants. And if the West is to retain its vibrancy, then it has to attract them. Now, it also has to take the steps to make sure that socially this works, and this works for the existing population. And I think in some cases that hasn't happened. So I think there's no easy answer, and this will be one of the great contentious issues for the next 50 years. Long beyond the scope of my 25-year forward look. But I think principle one, yes, it is. Yes, the right immigrants are good for your economy. Principle two, you have to have it controlled. Principle three, we have to be careful attracting. It is not in the self-interest of a country which has educated its best people in the emerging world to lose those people. So one hopes that those people will also at some stage go back and use those skills locally.
Well, if we can turn those focuses onto what happened in the Gulf, there you had the oil-rich economies who could not develop themselves. And so they deliberately attracted immigrants like myself and Eddie for many years. And in order to get going, one of the problems throughout the Gulf, which you identified as education, was that the populations there were very lightly educated. They hadn't got the generations of education. And so the immigrants such as myself came in to make the economy work, produce an economy of a certain size in the UAE with a very large amount of foreigners, in Saudi Arabia less so. And now, as the populations are growing up and as the population increases, in the Gulf, they have the chance to replace the immigrants, the foreign workers, but over a period of a generation or more. It's not like going to happen tomorrow. The issue was in the Gulf, how do you keep your national identity? How do you retain that sense of Emirati identity or Saudi identity in the middle of this pool of foreigners who are in some cases a majority, in some cases are half the population? So the controlled migration was very much the point. It's different from the north. In the north, where the young Arabs are growing up in countries like Iraq, and Syria, which has been wrecked by successive civil war, you've got young people growing up in far greater numbers. And there they are not buying into the political stability because there's no, and so it's a seriously destabilizing factor.
And it's one of the telling factors that in UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, there actually is a bias now against migrants from the Arab world. And they prefer to have people who are from the Indian subcontinent and from the, from Far East, because they're easily, you can kick them out.
Yeah, I mean, I think the tough attitude towards migration in much of the Middle East, in the UAE, Saudi, and so on, actually has not worked too badly at all. My view from a distance, this has actually been a considerable success story. But relying on inward migration to get you going is different from an established country needing to rely on immigrants to cover the fact that you are aging very fast.
Correct. If we may perhaps move on from immigration and take a look at the rivalry perhaps between China, its Belt and Road policy. I say rivalry with the Dubai in particular has set up a network of ports around the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, where it's trying to sort of develop stability in some very shaky areas. The Indians also are concerned about that. So the Belt and Road is something which, sometimes rather elaborately is called the Silk Road, but actually it's a series of investments where China seems currently to be burning its fingers a bit, but is nonetheless extending. Do you see that style of Chinese expansion and investment being a key part of how China puts itself into the world?
I think there's been quite a lot of pushback against China. China adopted perfectly reasonably a tough negotiating and contractual attitude. So if you don't pay back, we will take over those assets. And I think there've been a number of areas where yes, the ports have been put in, but it's put huge pressure on countries that have not managed those assets well. I'm thinking of Greece, Colombo. There are lots of places where you're probably closer to this than I am. But I think, therefore, the mood has shifted somewhat, both within China and indeed in much of the emerging world, that we need to be careful. If we want to build an airport, sure, the Chinese will build us for it, but actually we need to keep some sort of control ourselves, and we need to look at the various options we have for financing that airport, including, by the way, our own diaspora. One of the things that really interests me is the growth of local sources of funding, local stock exchanges and so on, attracting the funds of the diaspora. So I think that what will happen, the good news is the infrastructure is being put in, and that's you've got to do that. The way in which it will be financed will, I think, shift a little bit away from China's Belt and Road, and the fact that other wealthy, other fast-growing, huge nations such as India are putting in infrastructure elsewhere, I think is wholly positive.
When I was in Dubai, one of the logics of building that vast new airport with 6 runways was the fact that geographically it's in a very happy position to be a logistical center between what they described as a prosperous Asia with a large middle class, and likely to stay that way for a long time, and an emerging prosperous Africa with a middle class which is coming right quite quickly. And they said, okay, Europe is still up there in the far north, but Asia and Africa are the ones which matter to us. How would you put that into your model?
Well, it's absolutely one of the themes that I think I hope emerges from it. I think one of my hopes in the book is that Africa would actually come right. I pointed out how it is the fastest growing region of the world, economy. And we've looked at some of the projections for population, which suggest it will continue to be the fastest growing region for the foreseeable future. And yes, I mean, there is already a significant middle class there, but there will be a huge emerging middle class.
Yes.
And that is the market for
with spending power and all that middle class brings.
Well, spending power and also the attitudes that middle class brings. The middle class will want security. It'll want protection of assets. It will want some say in the way the show is run. And we can talk about democracy or an autocracy that listens very carefully to its middle class. So I think that the social impact of the fact that already half the world is middle class, 2/3, 3/4 of the world will be middle class in another 30, 40 years' time, that will actually have a huge influence, not just on countries that will sit in the right position geographically, but actually for global stability more generally.
Right. Eddie.
Yes, well, I'm going to diverge a little bit, Francis, onto the question that you've just raised about democracy. And this month has been a coruscating moment for us in the Anglosphere. Well, we got an election on Thursday, which looks like it could be historic in terms of elimination of the Conservatives, but I'm not going into the detail. But then with the presidential election, and you do in chapter 6 of your book, you say the many challenges to democracy, and you do refer to this as being a seminal part of the work you're doing. You are positive in the end. You think there's no alternative, but you also conclude that the Francis Fukuyama thesis, that in the end we're all going to become like America or some version of it, that forecast is no longer valid. Is there anything that you've seen? I mean, you look what's happened over the last week, and we are speaking less than a week after Joe Biden's debate with Trump live, extraordinary moment. Do you see anything in what's happening in America with the problems the Democrats have got in getting a viable candidate and the rise of Trump? Do you see anything there that suggests, and also with the Marine Le Pen development in France, the Giorgia Meloni in Italy, the Orban in Hungary? Do you see anything there that suggests the forecasting you made here 2 years ago and the rather sanguine projection you were making for the way we're governed? Do you see anything this year that calls into question maybe the robustness of the parliamentary democratic systems that Western Europe has had, America has got, and that maybe the whole liberal enlightenment is running out of steam, and maybe democracy we've understood it, or at least as America and the West has projected it, is running out of steam? Do you feel there's any merit in that kind of observation?
Well, I think it's a very good way of framing what's happening, running out of steam. But you could also say it's a question of liberal overreach. And one of the things I wrote, the thing in that book I wrote 25 years ago, well, now, the thing I'm most pleased about, is the wrong way maybe to phrase it, but actually I was able to suggest that there would be some kind of populist revolution in America, probably in the middle of the second decade of the century. Now, the Trumpism, a rebellion against the liberal elites. I mean, I didn't mention the word Trump because I didn't know enough about how. I don't think you could have predicted that in the early 90s. But I could. But it was easy. And I'm not that clever. It can't have been that difficult to predict that there would be some kind of big pushback against the liberal elite in America, and that happened. And so now, in a way, I'm almost comforted by the fact that this is all out in the open. You've got liberal overreach, a group of people who are doing very well, and I'm afraid, in the case of Hillary Clinton, sneer at people who aren't doing so well, and that won't do. I think what's emerged is completely normal and natural. And it's happening within the democracies. It's happening in France, with Marine Le Pen seeming to be much more moderate than she might have sounded, or actually much more moderate than 5 years ago. We've seen Maloney running a very relatively competent administration again. So I think Orban, I'm not sure about. I don't feel comfortable with the prospect of a Trump presidency at all. But I do think that in the messiness of democracy, some sort of the countervailing forces are taking place. One of my fears, I have 10 fears at the back, is we will lose democracy. But on balance, I'm more confident that we will hold it together in most of the democracies of the world.
Because one of the advantages of a democracy is that the change happens in a relatively peaceful institutional manner. That one of the disadvantages of autocracy, which even a listening autocracy, which large numbers of the Gulf are, is that they get stuck, and you have some single ruler leaving everything far too long and not listening. And so the great advantage of a democracy is that institutional change, and that is what's happening.
I think the Gulf states would say, sorry, am I muted?
No, we can hear you.
Yeah, the Gulf states would say they are democracies. They have a consultation process. No, they have they listen to the people. There is people's will is expressed, but they govern in a different way without a parliamentary system that we're accustomed to.
I don't think they say they're democracy. I think they're listening autocracies, and they're very good at listening.
But they never describe themselves as autocracies.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Well,
not dictatorship, but the rulers rule.
Anyway.
We're coming towards the end. I'd like to pick up on something, Hamish, where Eddie's been a great fan of the BRICS, and you yourself say it's important. I'm a bit surprised at that. I'd say that it was a sort of rather cobbled together group, rather disparate, and very, very not in any way as connected as the G7, or which are much more coherent, much more single focus. I mean, you can't argue that the leaders of China, of India, and Brazil share very much at all.
That's what made it so clever. It was a focus for the rest of the world, rather than Western Europe, North America, and Japan, and the old G7. And you're absolutely right. The BRICS are very diverse. The present developed world is broadly very similar. But if you are getting a rebalancing of the world taking place, so that the emerging world, however you define it, becomes equal in economic size to the West, and then perhaps becomes somewhat larger in aggregate, very many more people, lower standards of living in most of it. But then the idea of the BRICS, the moment pushed by China, is one which I think enabled the emerging world suddenly to feel more self-confident, suddenly to feel that we are more important. The old political structures don't help us. Let's work in another one and see if that helps us more. And so I think it was the demonstration effect was really interesting, and I think that's why an idea it took off, quite aside from the cute acronym.
It's a very cute acronym, and it gives China a very nice base from which to develop itself.
Precisely.
Well, Eddie, any final thought, Eddie?
Well, there's a huge amount of the book, and we haven't touched on the climate change question.
No.
That's important. We're all going to be affected by climate. Yes,
that affects everything. That affects migration and growth and everything. So, but I think your point is made pretty clear. I mean, you're in line with the consensus that there is an issue here, and it's a question of timing. So that's, I mean, obviously from our point of view, the sorry, phone's going off.
Keep going.
From our point of view, if you're looking at sort of inflection points that disrupt the forecast of some people say what's happening in Gaza is a big inflection point. Do you find events in Gaza? I'm not getting into the pros and cons and the rights and wrongs of it. Do you think that the Gaza events is an inflection point which affects again your long-term forecast?
But I think, but also we'll make this the last point, and it's Gaza, but it's also climate, and the water stress in particular throughout the Middle East is a very big issue. The rivers and the lack of water.
Yes, I mean, I think I'd say two things. The first is, and I think you have to separate the two. There are links, but I think the Gaza issue would be huge. Whatever was, even if there was no change in climate whatsoever. And I've been to Jordan. I've been enormously impressed with by the way they handle the water issue there, which is absolutely huge. Yes. I think that from a global perspective, we don't yet know whether we have to panic about climate change, or whether the sort of incremental measures we are taking will be adequate to contain it. My fear is we should panic, and if you're going to panic, much better to panic earlier than late. But I think that all I can do as a non-specialist is to frame that debate, which is what I've tried to do. And I think I finished up saying that I just hope and think we will come to have a more protective attitude towards our planet, because we've got nowhere else to go. One thing has made me, since I wrote, more troubled, which is climate change seems to be happening faster. Global warming seems to be happening faster. One thing that's cheered me is some of the projections for population, which suggest, even one, which since I wrote, that world's population may start to fall within about 15 or 20 years' time.
Yes.
30, a whole generation early. So I think that the trick is not to have firm views that you never change. The trick is to have a framework for thinking about it. So when some new information comes along, positive or negative, you just incorporate that into your thinking. And I'm profoundly concerned about the environment, but I sort of can't help feeling there will be things that come along that are positive too.
And on that hopeful note, I think we have to stop. Hamish, thank you very much indeed. Eddie, thank you. Thank you both.
My pleasure.
So there we have a very interesting look ahead to some of the big forces which are going to change our world. Now, you have heard some ideas there which you may agree with, and you've certainly heard some you're probably going to disagree with. So what we would like to do is hear from you. Please comment on what you've heard. Please come in and join the debate, and let's see what we're going to do in the next 50 years, although Hamish was actually talking about 30. We're all looking ahead. His point there on climate change, that is it too soon to panic, or is it we have to start panicking quickly, is one I think you might like to pick up on. Meanwhile, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.